Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today I'm looking at the Gigabyte MO27Q28G, a highly attractive 27-inch 1440p gaming monitor that uses one of the new 4th gen primary RGB tandem WOLED panels. I first tested a variant of this panel a few weeks back in the Asus XG27AQ WMG, but Gigabyte are promising to bring it to market at a much lower price point of $550 US. If Gigabyte can nail the performance and features, this is set to be one of the best mid-range monitors. The MO27Q28G has a 1440p resolution and 280Hz refresh rate, matching the latest generation of QD-OLED monitors. However, this new 4th gen WOLED panel is brighter than 280Hz QD-OLEDs and so receives Display HDR True Black 500 certification instead of True Black 400. This means better brightness in SDR and HDR content, as we'll see throughout this review. Gigabyte's M-series OLEDs are using a new design that's been updated for 2025, and the MO27Q28G looks very similar to the MO27Q2 I reviewed a few weeks ago. The stand is now a small 6-sided metal plate, which is remarkably thin while retaining a lot of stability. The smaller footprint occupies less desk space, so you can use a broader range of keyboard orientations with this monitor, and the flat profile means you can still put things on top of it. The stand pillar is a metal tube with a relatively small diameter, but again, it's very sturdy and still allows for a wide range of ergonomic adjustment, including height, tilt, swivel, and pivot. The maximum height on offer is acceptable without being outstanding. I think the whole stand assembly, the base, the pillar, and everything looks excellent and is a big upgrade on previous Gigabyte monitors. The screen section itself is a variation of the typical central box design we see across a lot of OLEDs. The front is dominated by the panel, and there's no chin along the bottom edge, which is common with WOLEDs that use an even 4-sided design. The rear includes a plastic box which houses all the components, out from which the thin OLED panel extends. Gigabyte's design uses a range of different lines and vents and stuff, which looks fine enough. The entire design is either black or grey, giving it a neutral appearance that slots in well with most setups. There's no RGB LED lighting here. The port selection is okay. You get one DisplayPort 1.4, two HDMI 2.1, 24 gigabits per second ports, and a USB-C which supports DP Alt mode and 18 watts of power delivery. Both types of port require DSC, but ultimately do allow for 10-bit 1440p 280Hz. Disabling DSC limits the HDMI port to 8-bit 200Hz, so it probably would have been better if it was 48 gigabits per second. There's also a 2-port USB 3.2 5 gigabits per second hub and KVM switch support. For consoles, it supports up to 4K 120Hz downscaling over HDMI, but this is with chroma subsampling enabled. The maximum without subsampling is 60Hz. The OSD on this monitor is controlled through a directional toggle and includes lots of features like separate display modes, lots of gaming specific features like crosshairs, shadow boosting, FPS counters, and other information readouts, and a good amount of OLED care features as well. It's a fast and easy to navigate interface, which is always nice to see, but for the most part it looks very similar to other Gigabyte monitor OSDs. 4th generation WOLED shifts all 1440p panels across to using the new RGWB subpixel layout. This is a separate improvement to primary RGB tandem, but it's still important for improving text quality compared to earlier 1440p WOLEDs that used RWBG. It's not a perfect solution, but text is clearer and closer in appearance to an LCD in most circumstances, with less horizontal shadowing. There is still some shadowing and artifacts related to the inclusion of the white subpixel, particularly at smaller font sizes, so this panel isn't quite at the level of an LCD. However, I'd say it's reasonably good for a bit of web browsing or document editing. This makes WOLED at this resolution more competitive with QD-OLED. Whether or not it reaches parity with triangle RGB QD-OLED is subjective and even dependent on things like font and text size. QD-OLED has its own issues with pink-green fringing above and below text, so neither panel is artifact-free. I don't have strong thoughts here on which is better. I might slightly prefer QD-OLED, but really neither is quite as crisp as an IPS LCD, and in general, it's usable for desktop tasks and a non-issue while gaming. One of the big differences between the MO27Q28G and the Asus XG27AQ WMG is that while both use primary RGB tandem panels, the Gigabyte option has a matte finish while the Asus option is glossy. Along with the price difference, this could be one of the major deciding factors for you, given people tend to have strong preferences between glossy and matte. The first thing to be aware of is that this is a better matte coating than previous WOLED panels. The new 4th gen panel structure reflects less light and so better preserves black depth in rooms with ambient light. It still diffuses direct sources of light quite noticeably, but generally the new 4th gen panel looks slightly blacker. Direct reflections are slightly dimmer as well, while maintaining a similar amount of diffusion, though it's interesting the new 4th gen panel has a bit of a purple hue to reflections that you don't necessarily get on older panels. The level of grain and clarity is similar. Compared to the true black glossy coating that ASUS use on the G27AQ WMG, there are obviously quite a few differences. The matte finish diffuses reflected light, while the glossy finish is more like a mirror. If your room setup is bright, or if there are light sources pointing at the display, such as a window, reflections can be distracting with glossy, and that's where matte might be better. Conversely, the matte finish scatters light across the surface, whereas the glossy finish doesn't, which typically gives the glossy finish a richer and deeper appearance in situations without significant reflections. Glossy finishes also appear sharper and clearer as they lack any coating grain. I personally really like the glossy finish and prefer it to matte, but the coating that's most suitable for you will depend on your setup. The true black glossy finish is excellent in darker rooms and quite good in moderately lit environments as well, but it may require some optimization of your setup to minimize reflections. Matte, on the other hand, works better in situations where you have less control over lighting and have to use the screen in a specific position. In a sense, matte is a safer bet if you're not sure whether reflections will be distracting or not in your setup. Then there's the comparison to QD-OLED glossy. 4th gen WOLED matte finishes handle ambient light much better than QD-OLED and preserve deeper blacks across a broad range of conditions. QD-OLEDs handle direct reflections quite well, but a matte finish is still superior at handling direct lighting and will be less distracting if you have to use the screen near a window. The main benefit to QD-OLED glossy is the lack of coating grain, giving it superior clarity in darker environments. OLED panels of all varieties are susceptible to permanent burn-in. You won't get burn-in while playing games or watching videos, but the panel will burn in over time when displaying static content for long periods. This makes OLED less well suited for productivity uses, where you'll be looking at static desktop apps all day, and you can check out our ongoing OLED burn-in series to see how real-world productivity use affects burn-in. The occasional amount of static app usage is fine, so don't worry about doing a bit of web browsing between gaming sessions. I just wouldn't recommend OLED as a monitor for hours of work. Gigabyte offer an industry-standard 3-year burn-in warranty. Response time performance is excellent on this WOLED monitor. This display technology offers lightning-fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark, and performance doesn't change at lower refresh rates, one of the many benefits of OLED for variable refresh rate gamers. Unlike with some LCDs, you don't need to adjust settings depending on the refresh rate you're using. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this WOLED and other OLED monitors. OLEDs are much faster than LCDs and have benefits such as no overshoot artifacts, consistent performance across the refresh rate range, and cumulative deviation indicative of near ideal behavior. With transition times an order of magnitude faster, OLEDs have around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity over an LCD at the same refresh rate. This means a 280Hz OLED offers a similar experience to a 420Hz LCD. Aside from comparisons to LCDs, the main thing you need to be aware of when buying an OLED for motion is that clarity on these panels is directly tied to refresh rate. At the same refresh rate, two different OLED monitors will look the same, so the actual refresh rate you'll be using while gaming is more important than the maximum refresh rate of the monitor. If you compare two OLEDs, one with a 240Hz max refresh, one with a 280Hz max refresh, but both are playing games at 120 FPS with a 120Hz refresh rate, they will look the same and give the same experience. Where higher refresh rate OLEDs become of benefit is when you use the highest refresh rate capabilities. When comparing a 280Hz OLED to a 240Hz OLED though, which are both in the same sort of price range, there's not a huge difference when gaming at the maximum refresh. 280Hz is slightly clearer, but with just a 17% increase in refresh rate, it's not a game changer, and I think most people will struggle to notice the difference. So I don't think you should pay much of a premium to access 280Hz over 240Hz. With this monitor, Gigabyte have matched ASUS on a couple of key features. One is black frame insertion, or BFI, which is branded as ultra clear in the Gigabyte OSD. This works exactly the same as ASUS's ELMB. At a 120Hz signal input, you get a clarity boost up to the level of 240Hz. It does this by technically running at 240Hz, but displaying every second frame as black. No other refresh rate configurations are supported, and to enable ultra clear, you have to disable adaptive sync and HDR. As BFI is only supported in a very specific configuration, it's quite a niche feature, but it does work and enhances the motion clarity of 120Hz gaming to look like 240Hz. It's not as advanced as backlight strobing on most LCDs, which use a shorter backlight pulse to achieve much clearer motion clarity than this OLED can provide. It's a nice bonus feature, though not something I would personally use. The other is anti-flicker. Gigabyte now offer a similar mode, which is found under the VRR menu. This setting, labeled anti-flicker just like ASUS, has 3 settings, which raise the minimum refresh rate to different levels. Off has a minimum of 48Hz, medium is 80Hz, and high is 160Hz. Low frame rate compensation, which allows for an effective refresh rate of 0 to 280Hz, is only available on middle or with the setting disabled. So to prevent tearing and a jarring loss of smoothness below 160Hz, I would not use the high mode. TFT Central have a great article exploring OLED flicker, why it occurs, and how this anti-flicker mode helps to minimize it. Essentially, on WOLED panels, gamma is tied to refresh rate. Large swings in refresh rate cause visible gamma shifts, which can be perceived as flicker. Narrowing the VRR range reduces the total amplitude of gamma swings during periods of frame rate fluctuation, but doesn't fully eliminate the issue. This aligns with what we've experienced using these modes. Gigabyte and ASUS anti-flicker modes reduce the severity of flicker, but it doesn't fully eliminate the issue. Input latency is excellent at the maximum refresh rate, offering a sub 1 millisecond processing delay in the SDR mode. Combined with fast response times and a decent refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use. The only way to achieve better latency is through a higher refresh rate model, for example 360Hz or one of the latest 500Hz options. The processing delay at 60Hz isn't amazing at around 5 milliseconds, but this is much better than the equivalent ASUS model. What we found in the ASUS review is that the new 4th Gen WOLED panel is more efficient than previous WOLEDs. This is also true with the MO27Q28G, however this model isn't quite as power efficient as the ASUS variant for whatever reason, consuming 43 watts in our full white test. That's 19% more than the XG27AQWMG and only slightly less than previous panels. For mid-APL gaming, I recorded 34 watts, which is pretty typical among all OLED monitors of a similar size and refresh, so it's not an immediate standout in terms of efficiency. 4th Gen WOLED brings the first major improvement to color space coverage that we've seen from this technology. Previous panels typically hit around 97% DCI-P3 coverage. That's been bumped up to 99.8% with this new WOLED, and the difference is even larger when we look at the full Rec 2020 HDR gamut. Last gen WOLEDs all sat in the 72% range, while this new primary RGB tandem WOLED leaps forward to offer 84.1% coverage, which is right up there with the best monitors I've tested, including LCDs. This is a slightly wider color gamut than QD-OLEDs, which were previously the leading OLED technology for color space coverage, and it certainly eliminates the gap in saturation between the two options. To get the best color performance out of the MO27Q28G, it's essential to update the firmware if you get a launch unit. When I originally received this monitor, it was running an old firmware and it performed pretty badly. Then Gigabyte sent over the new F05 firmware as a beta version. It'll be available officially in early October, and performance improved substantially. So these are the results from F05 firmware. Factory calibration is reasonable with a very good color temperature, but a bit of an inaccurate gamma in the lower part of the grayscale range, which makes dark shades a bit too dark. Like a lot of wide gamut gaming monitors, the color space is left unclamped for SDR use, leading to oversaturation in content like YouTube videos. Compared to other monitors, these results are mid-range, typical sorts of numbers, nothing hugely impressive. This display works nicely with Windows 11 auto color management. Enabling this feature gives you 99.3% sRGB color space coverage, and oversaturation is eliminated, leading to a Delta E color average below 5.0. As the built-in sRGB mode locks various settings, this is a great way to improve accuracy while preserving access to everything in the OSD. On the other hand, the sRGB mode is very good. Grayscale performance improves to a Delta E ITP average of just 2.77 thanks to a much better gamma curve, and this is really solid performance overall. We also see saturation and color checker performance in the 3.0 range, indicating great factory calibration when this mode is utilized. Compared to other displays using their sRGB modes, the MO27Q28G sits right near the top of the charts, outperforming the similar XG27AQWMG from ASUS. If you'd like a color accurate SDR experience, this monitor can give you that with a simple switch into the sRGB mode. Yeah, you can improve things using CalMan and an ICC profile, but personally, I would just use the sRGB mode or Windows 11 auto color management. HDR brightness is noticeably higher from this new 4th gen OLED panel than previous options. What surprised me is the brightness result from this Gigabyte monitor is even higher than the Asus option at 368 nits, which is 11% better than the AQWMG. This means the monitor is 40% brighter than the last gen OLEDs and 47% brighter than typical QD-OLED panels at a similar refresh rate, which is a pretty significant difference that really makes this monitor usable in a wider range of environments. This new panel is also 22% brighter than the 1440p 500Hz QD-OLED panel that was introduced a few months ago, which isn't as significant of a difference, but it does mean OLED can claim the crown in this metric. Minimum brightness is great at 36 nits despite the increase to max brightness. Viewing angles from this OLED panel are great, no concerns there whatsoever. Typically what you are getting is better than what you'll see from an LCD. Uniformity was perfectly fine when viewing white, but this 4th gen panel does not improve grey uniformity substantially, so there is still some banding and dirty screen effect when viewing uniform dark grey backgrounds. This is not an issue you'll see with QD OLED, and it can be visible in some desktop apps that use dark grey for the interface. Moving now into the HDR section, and OLEDs are a great choice for HDR, as many people will already know. The main strengths to this panel type are individual pixel control and zero-level blacks, which create high levels of local contrast. With such fine control over the image, OLEDs can display amazing contrast even if a bright and dark area are right next to each other. Combined with rapid response times and low input lag, OLEDs keep up with the demands of fast-paced HDR gaming without introducing artifacts or delay. The main weakness to OLED for HDR is overall brightness, especially in brighter, high APL scenes. LCDs with zoned backlights are the main alternative to OLED. These types of panels get brighter than OLED and don't have burn-in concerns, which might be better suited to your preferences. However, they lack individual pixel control, which in unfavorable scenarios leads to reduced contrast, zone artifacts, and in some cases, weak highlight brightness. Zoned LCDs also have higher input lag, and the backlight can struggle in fast HDR games. The best LCDs still deliver a great overall HDR experience, but OLEDs are typically a better and more premium option for gamers, which is why in most situations they're a bit more expensive. The MO27Q28G has a range of different HDR configurations, but I'm going to focus on the most interesting ones, starting with the default mode, which is just labeled HDR. This mode has the best accuracy across the board, with close tracking to the ideal EOTF curve and no issues with content being too bright or too dim. However, it's capped to 630 nits of brightness at best, which is less than half of what the screen can do in peak situations. It's a higher limit than the True Black 400 modes on most QD OLEDs, and it looks better as a result, but it's still not getting the most out of the panel. Staying in the HDR mode but changing the APL stabilize setting in the OLED care menu from middle to high raises peak brightness to the maximum this panel is capable of, around 1500 nits. But there's a few drawbacks, the main being highlight over-brightening, the same issue you get with the Asus primary RGB tandem model in a similar configuration. Essentially, this mode gives you good accuracy in bright scenes with no panel dimming, and good accuracy in dark scenes where the content's brightness level is supposed to be below 80 nits. But any element above 80 nits gets over-brightened, so a highlight that's meant to be, say, 200 nits becomes 400 nits in this mode. This is different to QD OLED over-brightening, where in some modes the entire scene gets doubled in brightness, even for darker elements, making lower APL scenes look too bright, almost as if the screen is just running at a higher brightness setting. This OLED panel in this configuration only over-brightens some things in dark scenes, usually highlights, which is more acceptable and makes dark content look better relative to over-bright QD OLED configurations. In most content, this mode looks normal and quite accurate, with the exception being brighter than normal highlights. The other potential issue with this configuration is that it only reports a brightness of 541 nits to Windows, which is lower than the true 1500 nits the panel can produce. This may result in lower than expected brightness in some games and tools that rely on this peak brightness figure, but it shouldn't be an issue in most content. There's another interesting configuration labeled HDR Peak 1500, which does accurately report a brightness figure of 1532 nits to Windows. This configuration works differently to the default HDR mode with APL stabilize set to high. In fact, it gives you basically the opposite performance. Instead of highlights being brightened in dim scenes, highlights are dimmed in bright scenes. So we get accurate EOTF tracking in low APL content, but effectively a form of panel dimming in high APL content. Again, not the same as QD-OLED panel dimming, which dims the entire high APL image, but it's dimming that only impacts areas of content that should be above 100 nits, which in bright scenes can be large portions of the display. On top of this, the HDR Peak 1500 mode has much worse color performance and lower overall saturation. The default HDR mode has a normal, accurate level of saturation, while the HDR Peak 1500 mode is undersaturated. This, combined with the dimming in bright scenes, makes this mode look noticeably worse in most real-world content, so even though EOTF characteristics are different in this configuration than the others, I just can't recommend using it. In synthetic brightness tests, the MO27Q28G is the brightest OLED I've tested so far. Full screen brightness reaches 377 nits in the usable modes, which is 18% brighter than the Asus model and 42% brighter than typical QD OLEDs. 10% window brightness is over 600 nits, again noticeably superior to QD OLEDs, and then 2% window brightness hits an astonishing 1484 nits. Previously, with WOLED panels that claim high levels of brightness, I've had to use a 1% window to reach those figures, but here it's actually possible at 2%, and this is again over 40% higher than competing QD OLEDs in terms of raw number. Real scene brightness results are strong. In the HDR mode with APL stabilize high, we see no panel dimming, though weak accuracy in low APL scenes. This is the brightest OLED configuration yet, reaching over 1300 nits in real scenes, and even in high APL content, over 380 nits is common. In comparison, we can look at the AW2725D, which is a typical 280Hz QD OLED at a similar price. In its Peak 1000 mode, it has panel dimming, it only reaches around 950 nits real-world best case, and in high APL content, the Gigabyte W OLED is more than twice as bright. Yes, some highlights are too bright with the W OLED, but overall the HDR image is far superior and more consistent across a variety of content. There's a few other interesting comparisons to look at. The Gigabyte model is 19% brighter on average than the Asus model and produces better results in all 8 tests. This also aligns with the synthetic numbers and the SDR testing, which shows the Gigabyte model to be brighter overall. It looks like Gigabyte have simply cranked up this panel higher. The MO27Q28G is also 13% brighter on average than the best QD OLED I've tested, the 272QPX50 in MSI's EOTF boost mode. Even the regular HDR mode is better than most QD OLED configurations, especially in brighter content. Dark scene accuracy isn't great when APL stabilize is set to high, and this is where QD OLED Peak 1000 modes have an edge. The level of over-brightening is worse than the Asus model. Bright scene accuracy is far superior to a typical QD OLED though, running in the Peak 1000 mode. Color match accuracy is also good, provided you don't use the HDR Peak 1500 mode. As I noted in the Asus review, color volume has increased with the new 4th Gen WOLED panel due to an increased color gamut and better brightness. However, best versus best QD OLED still has an 11% higher MDC and higher color brightness. In the Essentials checklist, Asus get a lot of the specifications correct, and I think this is the first time I've seen a BT 2020 color gamut figure quoted. There's a couple of things I have to pull them up on though, outside of the usual response time BS. A couple of the marketing images on the Gigabyte website imply this monitor has essentially 0 bezels, which isn't the case in real life, despite being a 4-side borderless design. While it may pass some flicker-free certifications, it's also not technically flicker-free, as WOLED has a short pulse at each refresh. This causes eye strain for a very small minority of users. I'm not the biggest fan of the name MO27Q28G. It's a bit too long and unwieldy compared to other Gigabyte monitor names, which are usually a maximum of 6 characters. This is probably a monitor people will want to search for, so a catchier name would have been more appropriate. In the feature support matrix, Gigabyte offer a decent selection of things here. They do offer both USB-C and a KVM switch, along with built-in speakers. It's also a passively cooled design. However, there's no Dolby Vision support, and there's the usual drawbacks to OLED. The Gigabyte MO27Q28G is the best upper mid-range gaming monitor that I've tested, and I think it will be hard to beat when it launches at the end of this month. This new 4th generation primary RGB tandem W OLED panel is excellent and offers new levels of performance that OLED hasn't provided previously. At a price tag of just $550 US, that's the global MSRP not including tariffs, it's an amazing bang for buck display. LG Display have closed the gap between WOLED and QD-OLED entirely with this latest panel, to the point where I now believe that WOLED offers clearly stronger performance in most areas. When you compare this 280Hz WOLED to 280Hz QD-OLEDs, we see SDR and HDR brightness that's up to 40% higher, no annoying panel dimming issues, and a screen composition that better handles ambient light and generates deeper perceived blacks. Color gamut and text quality are now similar as well, whereas WOLED lagged behind previously. This means there are a few areas I can point to where QD-OLED offers a better experience. The glossy screen coating may be preferred by some, though I like how this matte finish handles ambient light. Dark grey uniformity and color brightness in the HDR mode are definitely superior on QD-OLED, but in general, I think this 4th gen WOLED panel produces a better image in a wider range of conditions. Of course, on top of this, we get all the usual OLED benefits that make this panel type so appealing to gamers. Elite response times for excellent motion clarity at a decent 280Hz refresh rate, low input lag in the SDR and HDR modes, per pixel control for high contrast HDR and deep zero level blacks, great brightness, especially for small highlights. Gigabyte have calibrated this panel well across the SDR and HDR modes for the most part, especially with the sRGB mode and the default HDR configuration. There's a bit of over-brightening in the best HDR config, but this isn't nearly as annoying as QD-OLED panel dimming or the hacks manufacturers have used to get around it. That said, I would recommend buyers upgrade the display to the latest firmware as soon as they get it. In 2025, Gigabyte are also stepping up their game in terms of design and features. I think this new M series look is excellent and the flat metal base makes a lot of sense. They've added black frame insertion and an anti-flicker mode to this display for the first time, giving it an excellent feature set that holds up well against the Asus Juggernaut. And we're also getting stuff like a KVM switch, USB-C and built-in speakers. While this is a very good gaming monitor that I really like, I ultimately do prefer the Asus primary RGB tandem model, the XG27AQWMG, because it uses a glossy finish. I just prefer the way that panel looks to the matte finished Gigabyte have used here. But Asus are charging $700 US for their model, while Gigabyte are charging just $550, and the Gigabyte model has slightly better brightness. It's just not worth spending $150 more to get a glossy coating, when outside of that, the two products deliver a pretty similar experience. That's a 27% price premium, making the Gigabyte model much better bang for buck. I would also buy the MO27Q28G over any 240Hz or 280Hz QD-OLED on the market because this new Gigabyte model is simply better. It's brighter and looks better in real-world HDR content as it offers a more consistent experience with deeper blacks in ambient lighting. It's also about the same price. The Dell Alienware AW2725D 280Hz QD-OLED, for example, is $550, while 240Hz QD-OLEDs like the MSI 271QPX-E2 are down around $500. I'd comfortably spend $50 more to get this Gigabyte monitor. In Australia, the pricing is a bit less favourable though. They're quoting $850 Australian dollars, while the AW2725D is $700. $850 isn't that bad given it's $550 US, that's about right. It's just the Alienware model is insanely cheap for us locally for whatever reason. That's why it always pays to check local pricing in your region for all models, because occasionally there are deals like that sort of thing. So I'd still be leaning towards the Gigabyte model because it is a genuinely better product, but if pricing in your region is better for QD-OLED models, or at least substantially better, then you may still swing that way. Anyway, that's it for this review. I know a lot of you guys have been requesting this one, but I've been working on it for a little while now, so now you can see how the MO27Q28G performs. If you are interested in purchasing this monitor or any of the other displays that we talk about in this review, so if you use our reviews to decide upon a monitor that you want to buy, then we do have links in the description below where you can do so, and also just check pricing in your region and that sort of thing, which can come in handy. So definitely do that if you're interested. We also have our Patreon page, which is a place you can support hardware hardware unboxed and monitors unboxed. You support the independent testing that we do, so you get some pretty cool benefits in return. Discord community, ICC profiles, all that sort of stuff. So check that out if you want. Anyway, that's it for this one, and I'll catch you in the next one.